tell a real production failure story in Azure while you were working as a Azure senior developer. You could answer in the lines of, the failure I usually point to was a downstream cascade caused by a retry storm, and it taught me something I now design around by default. We had an event driven integration where messages came off on an Azure service bus queue. An Azure function processed each one, and that function made a call to a downstream third party API to enrich the data. It had run cleanly in production for months. Then one morning we started getting alerts. Our dead letter queue depth was climbing fast, and at the same time, the downstream third party API's latency went through the roof. The situation was that the third party API had started returning intermittent errors on their end. Nothing we did caused it, but the real damage was our own design. Our function was treating every failure as a transient, so every failed message was being retried, and the service bus trigger was happily scaling out more and more function instances as the queue backed up. So we had more instances, all retrying, all hammering an API that was already struggling. We weren't just failing, we were actively making the downstream problem worse and effectively distributed denial of servicing a partner. My task was to stop the bleeding first and then fix the root cause properly. For the immediate action, I capped the function's concurrency, so we stopped scaling out into the outage, which took the pressure off the downstream API almost immediately. Then I used our correlation IDs to trace transaction through application insights and confirm exactly where messages were failing and that no data had actually been lost. Everything was either retrying or sitting safely in the dead letter queue, which is the one good thing about that morning. For the real fix, I changed the error handling in the function to distinguish transient from permanent failures properly, and I added exponential backoff so retries backed off instead of hammering. The deeper fix was adding a circuit breaker. Once the downstream error rate crossed a threshold, we stopped calling it and let messages queue durably instead. Then resumed when it recovered. So a downstream outage became a graceful pass instead of a cascade. The result was that we recovered that morning with no data loss. And once the circuit breaker shipped, the next time the same API had a wobble, it was a non event. Messages just buffered on the queue and drained when it came back. The lesson I took away and that I now treat as a design default is that in a distributed system, your retry logic is a load generation mechanism. If you don't bound concurrency, distinguish transient from permanent failure, and back off when something downstream is unhealthy, your own resilience logic becomes the thing that amplifies a small problem into an outage. I designed that in from the start now rather than learning it twice.